The Dark Knight Returns is a comic you've probably heard of before. Released in 1986 and written by Frank Miller, this is one of the most important Batman stories of all time. And if you haven't heard of this comic, you've definitely seen the ways this book has impacted the cultural landscape of comic book adjacent media. The book has influenced TV shows, video games, films, and even other comics. The comic has become so synonymous with Batman, it's difficult to imagine what the cultural climate surrounding Batman would look like without this book's influence. But did you know this book has a sequel? And that sequel is widely regarded by fans and critics alike as pretty bad. But it doesn't stop there. The sequel to that book has an even more overlooked sequel that was met with some mixed reviews. And the sequel to that book has another sequel that almost no one talks about. It's interesting that one of the most prominent and impactful pieces of Batman media spawned its own little universe. A universe that has some really interesting highs, but also some insanely dull and borderline problematic lows. All of these sequels were written by Frank Miller, one of the most prolific writers in the comic book space. So on paper, it seems like a recipe for success, but in application, successful isn't the word I would use to describe these sequel books. So what happened? Well, join me in this video as we take a look at the fascinating downfall of Frank Miller's Dark Knight. Published in 2001 to 2002, The Dark Knight Strikes Again was Frank Miller's long-awaited return to the Batman Elseworld Miller established decades earlier in 1986. The plot is honestly a feverish and unintelligible mess, but in brief summary it goes something like this. Authoritarian leaders have cultivated immense power. The age of heroes is a bygone era, with the only superheroes seemingly left standing being Superman, Wonder Woman, and Captain Marvel. Once free agents who stood for moral good, now shells of their former selves, bowing in submission to the United States government. Following the events of The Dark Knight Returns, Batman went underground but never stopped working. Bruce and his sidekick Carrie Kelly, formerly known as Robin and now known as Catgirl, continue their crusade against tyranny by building and training an army of masked vigilantes known as Bat Boys. The first mission of the Dark Knight was to orchestrate a series of raids on government facilities, freeing superheroes who were held captive. These missions led to the forceful release of the Atom, Flash, and Plastic Man, who all joined Batman in his crusade against tyranny. Pretty simple start, right? Unfortunately, the plot gets pretty bizarre really quickly. We find out that Superman, Wonder Woman, and Captain Marvel are working for the United States government because their loved ones are being held hostage. We then find out that the President of the United States is actually a hologram controlled by Lex Luthor and Brainiac. We get some panels of Batman throwing down with Superman. We find out that Superman and Wonder Woman have a love child who they've kept hidden from the world. A giant alien then attacks Metropolis, which Superman struggles to fight. Captain Marvel is killed in the fight. Laura, Wonder Woman and Superman's love child, is then revealed to the world, and the three of them decide that they must work with Batman to defeat Lex Luthor. They end up defeating the giant alien who turns out to be Brainiac. Batman gets captured by Lex Luthor, but in classic Batman with prep time fashion, Batman's capture was actually a ruse to get closer to Lex. Lex Luthor is then killed by the son of Hawkman and Hawkgirl. Also, Green Lantern returns from space because I guess he was gone. The book concludes with Batman confronting a villain that looks like the Joker, but is actually Batman's former Robin, Dick Grayson. I guess Batman fired Dick Grayson many years ago, and since then Dick has undergone experiments that turned him into a superhuman with shape-shifting and healing powers. So, of course, Batman defeats Dick Grayson by cutting his head off and throwing it into a giant volcano that's hidden underneath the Batcave. If this sounds totally and utterly confusing, it's because it is. Miller's writing in this book is disjointed and almost entirely reliant on conversational dialogue to communicate what's going on. Normally, this wouldn't be a problem. I'm a big fan of the show don't tell style of storytelling. Unfortunately, in addition to doing the writing, Miller also pencils the art for this story. Frank Miller was once a fantastic artist. His contributions to the original Dark Knight Returns, Daredevil, and Wolverine have stood the test of time, and till this day are iconic pieces of art that most comic fans would recognize because Frank Miller's work is just that damn good. And when you read this book, you get inklings of beautiful moments that remind us why Frank Miller is an artist who has continued to push the medium of comics forward. Miller shines when he's given space to breathe and focus on crafting carefully penciled splash pages. The moments we get to see Superman drifting aimlessly in space, or Batman Batman standing tall and prideful highlight the spark, care, and continuous appreciation for the medium that Miller is known for. Tragically, his art just isn't consistent. Maybe it's because he's gotten older, maybe it was the deadlines he was forced to meet for the book, or perhaps it was his choice to use sharper lines and digital coloring. But for every stunning splash page, we're also met with dozens of panels filled with blocky characters, blurry action, goofy looking faces, and uncanny human anatomy. Reading this book, there were countless moments where I was forced to look at the same panel over and over because I couldn't understand what was going on. And because, like I mentioned earlier, Miller communicates textually through breakneck conversations, the mashup of non-stop dialogue and unintelligible art can make the story hard to follow. So when you take a step back and look at what this book is, it makes sense why so many people dislike it. The story is a non-stop mishmash of characters going from point A to point B with seemingly no other purpose than to push the plot forward. The stakes constantly swing upwards with bigger and badder threats on every page, which sounds good in theory, but the jumbled, ill-explained motivations of our heroes and villains leaves you feeling confused more than enthralled. The art in one moment will echo a surrealist stylized portrait that reminds you of the glory days of comics, but will then immediately whiplash you back to reality with the garish designs and colors of the next few pages that are seemingly penned by a different artist entirely. In short, The Dark Knight Strikes Again is a book that feels like it has the potential to be great. The premise of Batman spurring on a revolution against the fascist government who outlaws superheroes, controls information, and governs in secret is a fantastic premise. Unfortunately, the convoluted storytelling and messy artwork hinder the book's ability to shine. And it begs the question, how did someone who created one of the most impactful pieces of Batman media create something so fruitless? What happened to Frank Miller? In order to understand how we got here, we first need to look at where we started. From the very first Batman comic Miller ever wrote with The Dark Knight Returns, Miller's Batman has always served as a radical deconstruction of the character. While the concept of an aged up, pessimistic, and retired Batman being thrust into a crumbling society seems like a common trope today, when Miller first penned this concept in 1986, it was a reinvention of the character and the medium. The purpose of his Dark Knight was to recontextualize the character through a bold and exciting new lens. A 2015 interview Miller did with the French publication Lemonade summarizes this notion best, where Miller states,
"There had been several phases in my relationship with Batman. When I discovered him as a child, at the age of 5, he was a severe dad, a resolutely father figure. He stayed the same after, but I started to see him with more political, philosophical angles. In parallel, the content of the Batman comics evolved too. We went from a self-appointed vigilante and wild to an authority figure with a police badge. Under my pen, he became an anarchist."
You heard that right. Miller's Batman is an anarchist. But what does it mean to be an anarchist? Well, in Miller's own words,
"If you are an anarchist, you consider the existent order corrupted, and destroying it is the first thing you want to do, and for that, always are good ways. The Irish fight for independence, as well as the French resistance, showed us that taking to the streets could be necessary to rise against tyranny. Sometimes the only way to give a meaning to the world is to destroy the current order."
When I think about Batman, I view him as a figure who believes in moralistic good. Batman views people who do bad things as people who deserve to be punished for their actions, so he acts accordingly, working to incapacitate criminals, often resulting in those criminals being incarcerated. Today, there's a heated debate about the efficacy of Batman's methods. So many people state the obvious. Why would Batman work so hard to lock up the Joker for the 100th time just for the Joker to escape? And honestly, it's a good question. In the modern age of comics, there have been plenty of stories that have interrogated this fatal character flaw. But in 1986, that wasn't really the case. Comics back then showed us a Batman who was committed to maintaining the integrity and order of the criminal justice system. Batman was not a figure who would intervene in the judicial process. He would simply facilitate detainment. So when Miller steps onto the scene, I think he was thinking what we were all thinking. Why would Batman do the same thing over and over again, locking up criminals if nothing changes? And in order to answer that question, Miller reframed the foundation of Batman's moral framework. Miller wanted Batman to elicit change, and for him to do that, he would have to abandon his commitment to institutional order, because after all, these are the same institutions that let the Joker run rampant time and time again. So Miller did the unthinkable. He had Batman work against the government, kill the Joker, and become the leader of his own new world order. He turned Batman into an anarchist, and people loved it. It was bold, it was exciting, and it was invigorating, but it was also deeply out of character. However, people didn't care because it was executed with grace. Flash forward to 2001 and The Dark Knight Strikes Again comes out. Miller continued to feed into the anarchistic principles that define his postmodern reworking of Batman. In that regard, I think Miller did fantastic. Miller's Batman from 2001 feels like the same Batman from 1986. He's an old, senile, and pessimistic anarchist who's lost faith in institutional stability decades prior. While The Dark Knight Strikes Again fails in many regards, one thing it does spectacularly is remain consistent with its characterization of Batman. Forgetting about the shoddy pencils and shaky writing for a moment, there is one massive flaw that inhibits this book's ability to achieve the same potency of its predecessor, and that's the fact that Miller doesn't know what he wants the tone of the story to be. In an interview from 2006 for Comic Dom, Miller clarifies what he wanted to accomplish with The Dark Knight Strikes Again, stating,
"I was out to remind readers about the inherent joy and wonder that these superheroes offer, and also to celebrate their delicious absurdity. I saw the superheroes as gods and heroes in the classic sense, mighty, quirky, lustful, capricious, noble, petty, wrathful, unpredictable. Superman, Wonder Woman, Lara, Batman, Brainiac, Luthor, and Green Lantern are gods. Carrie Kelly and the rest are heroes, offsprings of gods and men. Batman is the greatest of these gods. Even though he can't leap tall buildings or throw cars around, he knows what he wants and he's smarter than any of them. He uses his pantheon to save humanity from its own self-embraced slavery. I wanted these gods and heroes out of that musty museum that they'd been stuck in, and to drag them back to the streets where they belong."
Respecting the legacy of Golden Age comics and reminding readers of the magic superheroes carry is a noble task. In theory, I love that idea. But then you remember what this book is. It's a sequel to a story that deconstructed the naivety of Batman's methodology. The Dark Knight Returns quite literally brought superheroes out of the Bronze Age and into the modern age. Thus, it becomes a seemingly paradoxical task. How can you continue to interrogate the anarchistic tendencies of Batman while simultaneously reminding the readers of the inherent joy that superheroes offer? Miller backed himself into a corner. Maybe with more issues and a better plotted story, it would have been an achievable task, but it would still be a difficult one. The pantheon of Golden Age superhero comics aren't remembered for their anarchistic tendencies, and inversely, The Dark Knight Returns isn't critically acclaimed because of its inherent joy. So, trying to mash these contradictory tones into one cohesive story is a recipe for disaster. Pair that with Miller's questionable art and inconsistent writing, and the core failures of this book make sense. It's a story that's trying to be too many different things. It wants to explore the downfall and subsequent rebirth of DC's most iconic characters. It wants to reignite the audience's youthful admiration for the medium of superhero comics. It also wants to introduce new mythology into Miller's Dark Knight universe, such as Laura, Superman, and Wonder Woman's daughter. But most importantly, it wants to be a sequel to Miller's postmodern reimagining of Batman. And that's not even mentioning the whole 9/11 thing. You see, when Miller was writing this book, he was living in New York, only a few blocks away from the World Trade Center. He witnessed firsthand the carnage and destruction of the 9/11 World Trade Center attack. It becomes readily apparent through interviews and Miller's subsequent work that the trauma he endured on 9/11 had a long-lasting impact on his psyche.
I can tell you squat about Islam. I don't know anything about it, but I know a goddamn lot about Al-Qaeda, and I want them all to burn in hell.
He spiraled down a rabbit hole of anger and Islamophobia that we can see on full display in his book Holy Terror. Issue 3 of The Dark Knight Strikes Again is an obvious nod to Miller's disorderly recollection of this trauma. In this issue, we see Metropolis in ruins, our heroes defeated, and smoke rising from the ashes of a once tall and proud city. It's a somber image that I'm sure comes from a place of deep agony. Luckily, Strikes Again doesn't see Miller indulging in the violent anti-Islamic fantasy that would define his later works. Instead, this scene just serves to be a potent reminder to the audience of the collective trauma that the people of New York endured, and it's a very beautiful moment. All that being said, within Miller's jumbled ideological dribble, thinly veiled anarchism, and staunch libertarianism, there is one thematic through line in this book that I think deserves credit, and that is what The Dark Knight Strikes Again tells us about the age of information. The status quo of Miller's postmodern hellscape is one of the most interesting parts of this book. As society progresses, technology changes, and the delivery of information becomes more sporadic and disorderly. In this universe, news broadcasts are loud, provocative, fast, and sometimes nonsensical. On a surface level, this delivery of information can be viewed from the reader's perspective as frustrating because it's hard to tell what's going on. But it was actually my good friend David who told me to read this book and view this style of storytelling with a very specific idea in mind. And when I used David's theory to read this book, Miller's convoluted television broadcasts start to make a lot more sense. I'll let David explain it to y'all.
New age media and technology is distracting you. At least that's what Frank Miller thought when writing The Dark Knight Strikes Again. One of the things that stuck out the most to me when reading this book for the first time was how random it was. Pages were randomly inserted pop-ups and people would be saying things that don't necessarily have anything to do with what's actually happening in the overall page. A lot of the times, Miller would do this during his news and broadcasting pages, a staple that he would come up with The Dark Knight Returns, before what was simply a panel layout to seem like it's a broadcasted news station. It's now sporadic all over the place. You have stuff like the nude news, and overall just doesn't feel orderly. This is one of the biggest reasons why a lot of people seem to think that Miller was off his rocker and his writing had completely plummeted. I, however, think this was intentional, and this was Miller's sort of way of predicting what the media and technology would become. During the late 90s into the new millennium, 2000s, one of the biggest things would be Y2K. The fear of the apocalypse once we entered the new millennium. Technology would not be able to restart, or technology would take over. I think Miller is briefly touching on this. The time of this story being written, technology is very much shifting, especially the internet. Now, where I don't think Miller believed that the world was going to end with Y2K, I do think that he thought it was going to be the end of journalism. Gone are the days where we would be getting our information from professionals and people that actually went to school for these things. And it would seem that on the internet, now anyone could really post anything. You fast forward to now, and that's very much true. And I think he relays this in scenes where people are just kind of spouting their opinion about stuff like the president, or even what's happening with Superman and Batman. It's all to distract you from the truth, what's in front of you, which I think is a really big thing that Miller is playing into, as obviously these books have a lot to do with fascism. Personally, I think this is also why Miller's artwork has such a drastic shift. One of the most critiqued things about the book is his art, but I think, again, there's some bit of intention when it comes to that. It could possibly be Miller testing the reader to see, are you going to still be able to understand what's happening in the story if I'm just drawing these bizarre images? Once again, it's very distracting. Now, I'm not defending and saying that this story is actually a hidden masterpiece and that Miller fooled everybody and you're the reason that you don't like the book. I definitely just think that Miller tried to aim for something and failed in execution. But you could definitely tell that Miller was just upset with how the world was going, with how media was being portrayed. And again, you fast forward to today and we have news networks that are complete jokes and don't care about facts, just simply pushing narratives.
That is a lot of fake news back there.
And when it comes to the technology part, well, we now have the whole world accessible to our hands with our phones, laptops, tablets, and the internet is faster than ever. The phrase, everyone's a critic, is now more true than ever. Hell, you'll probably do it on this video when you leave a comment down below. Whether you agree or not, I think Miller was definitely trying to say something more than what he put on the page.
Shout out David for putting me onto this idea. Go check out his YouTube account, Those Comics. He makes some great content. But back to the point. With all this in mind, in my opinion, it recontextualizes the good, the bad, and the ugly behind The Dark Knight Strikes Again. And you know what? You think from a rational perspective, this would be it. The sequel flopped and Miller would just move on to new projects. But for some reason, despite all the hate and negative reviews, Miller found himself returning to this universe once again with The Dark Knight 3. Master Race. The first issue of this book came out in November 2015, and the final issue came out in June 2017. This was a bi-weekly release with a total of 9 issues. Written once again by Frank Miller, but this time there was a cast of rotating artists, including Frank Miller and John Romita Jr., but the bulk of the series was penciled by Andy Kubert. And in my opinion, it's a whole lot better than The Dark Knight Strikes Again in almost every way. The writing, the art, the colors, and the overall tone of the story are much more consistent. For a brief overview, the plot goes like this. After the events of The Dark Knight Strikes Again, the mantle of Batman has been continued on by Carrie Kelly due to Bruce Wayne seemingly being deceased. Superman is no longer around either, as it's revealed he's been locked in a state of frozen over paralysis in the Fortress of Solitude. Wonder Woman and Superman's daughter Laura is getting older, but finding it harder to fit in. She feels as if she doesn't belong with the Amazons, she doesn't belong with humanity, and the only Kryptonians left are the ones trapped in the microscopic city of Kandor. Luckily for Laura, Ray Palmer, aka the Atom, found a way to restore Kandor to its fully sized self. However, immediately after returning Kandor to its normal size, it's revealed that the Kryptonians of Kandor had been slaughtered, with the remaining Kandorians left all being part of a zealous cult with a devoted following to their leader Quar. Now free to walk the Earth, they have one goal in mind: total planetary domination. Remember how I said earlier that Batman was dead? Well, he's not. So, in Batman fashion, the story turns into a tale of Batman recruiting Superman and other superhero allies so they can work together to stop the evil cult of Quar from taking over the world. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Like I mentioned earlier, this is 9 issues with some mini one-shot stories sprinkled in as well. And with this story, Miller is given the privilege of having more time to explain the context of his story. Miller explores his characters in a way that he never did with The Dark Knight Strikes Again, simply because he's got more pages to work with. The character of Laura is a standout to me, as her story feels vulnerable and oddly relatable, rather than feeling like a one-dimensional plot device like she did in Strikes Again. In this book, her character motivations, upbringing, and personal philosophy are clearly defined. Laura is an outcast. She was raised by hardened Amazonian warriors, and because of that, she has trouble integrating and finding the relatability in humanity. Inversely, she feels a fading connection to her Amazonian roots. What she wants most is to understand her Kryptonian side, but she barely knew her father, so she doesn't have that. It's a deeply relatable tale that I'm sure a lot of people can find solace in. History and cultural roots are interlinked with our contemporary understandings of purpose in the world. We all have an innate desire to fit in with an in-group, and a lot of the time, that in-group is defined by our cultural background. That's why things like patriotism, religious affiliation, and ethnic identity are so important, and using the character of Laura to explore that theme is a really smart play by Miller. Wonder Woman is also explored with much more nuance and depth in this book as well. We get to understand her point of view as a warrior, as an Amazonian, as a leader, but most importantly, as a mother. It's a much more earnest and layered characterization when comparing it to the type of one-dimensional punching bag she was shown to be in Strikes Again. And you can say the same thing with Superman. In this book, we finally get to understand why he found himself falling into fascism. We see how his internal compass shifted over time, and we lay witness to the regret and hurt he feels for his actions. But most importantly, Miller continues in his consistent characterization of Batman. As I mentioned earlier, Miller's Dark Knight Returns is so renowned because it deconstructs Batman and recenters the conversation to be about Batman's commitment to anarchy, apathy, and cynical pessimism. In a lot of ways, the Batman we see in The Dark Knight Returns has always been more out of character than the Batman we're used to. In this story, he feels more out of character than mainline Batman as well, and that's the point. It's consistent with what Miller has been giving us since the beginning. On top of that, this Batman is older, he's more cynical, he's more anarchistic, and he's more mission driven than he ever has been. But unlike Strikes Again, Miller isn't trying to appeal to the sensibilities of jovial golden age nostalgia. The biggest strength of this comic is that it reads like a contemporary story. The book came out in 2015, and it reads like a book that came out in 2015. The art feels modern, the writing is clear and concise, the action is flashy and fluid, and most importantly, the plot moves forward in a comprehensive manner. I know this sounds like the bare minimum, but once again, when comparing it to Strikes Again, it's leaps and bounds better in every single way. Parts of that may have to do with the fact that Brian Azzarello helped Miller write the story. I'm not sure what the extent of Azzarello's influence was, but it's worth noting. When reading this book, in my opinion, it feels like Azzarello was able to reel Miller in, making Miller focus less on the spectacle and more on character motivation, as it seems like gritty and grimy character dramas is what Miller does best. Back to Batman though. As mentioned earlier, Batman's characterization is that of a cold, meditative, and driven soldier. He views himself as a warrior, leading the charge in the war against crime and corruption. So much so that Batman views his own apprentice, Carrie Kelly, as a soldier. That idea alone is enough to piss off a lot of Batman fans. They're probably gearing up right now, getting ready to say, no, Batman loves his Robins. He views them as adopted children, not soldiers. This is a gross mischaracterization of the character. But once again, this is consistent with the version of Batman we get in 1986 with The Dark Knight Returns. He's lost his sensibilities for empathy and compassion, and he views the world as a nearly irredeemable breeding ground for corruption. On top of that, his time on Earth is dwindling by the minute. Of course, Batman is going to take whatever bodies he can get and turn them into weapons for anarchy. That's what Miller wanted to establish from the get-go, all the way back in 1986. I view Miller's Batman as an out-of-continuity version of Batman that aims to explore how and why Batman's mission of vengeance is a path that leads to both destruction and justice. It's a Batman who's lost empathy and given into the mission completely. It's a character study on both his physical strengths and mental flaws. And when you view it this way, it becomes less frustrating and more entertaining. All that to say, I enjoyed the plot of this book. It was fun, and it expanded on the best parts about Strikes Again. It's not perfect, it has some pacing issues, clunky moments, and a Deus Ex Machina style of resolution to the main conflict, but overall, it's not bad, and in my opinion, it's worth the read. However, there is one major issue with this book that needs to be addressed, and that is Frank Miller's Islamophobia issue. As we discussed earlier, 9/11 was a tragedy that fundamentally altered the way Frank Miller viewed the world. The unimaginable destruction filled his heart with feelings of loss, trauma, and rage. This cocktail of emotions was used to fuel his 2011 book Holy Terror, a story about a vigilante who goes on a violent mission to kill as many Muslim terrorists as possible. Ironically, Holy Terror was originally supposed to be a Batman story, but DC rejected it due to its incessant Islamophobia. The thing is, Islamophobia in comics isn't anything new. It's been in the medium for decades. If you're interested in a historical deep dive on how persistent Islamophobia has been in comic books, I'll link a video I made talking about it down below. Point being, what Frank Miller did in 2011 wasn't anything new, but it's still disappointing. But then you flash forward 4 years later to 2015, and Miller's lingering feelings of Islamophobia can still be seen in this book. It's just more subtle. The leader of the remaining Kandorians, Quar, is a religious zealot who's led by fundamentalist ideas. He wears a long robe and touts a polyamorous harem of wives, all of whom appear to be wearing hijabs. You'll often see the Kandorians congregating in the desert, surrounded by a vast expanse of sand, reminiscent of how the West commonly portrays Arab and Muslim countries. It's not a one-for-one comparison, but all of these tropes align with how Western media characterizes Muslim terrorists. They're people who wear hijabs, they're people that live in the sand, they're led by fundamentalist ideas, and they wear similar clothing to the clothing that Quar wears. Even if they aren't explicitly jihadists, their mission, their iconography, their methods, and their attire invokes a parallel that's very hard to ignore. Pair that with the fact that Frank Miller wrote Holy Terror, and the imagery in this book doesn't feel coincidental. Maybe Miller wasn't trying to use the Kandorians as an analog for Muslim terrorists. Maybe he wanted to use them to comment on the holistic danger of religious ideation as a whole. Maybe Miller was still working through his own grief all these years later, and the pain manifested through internalized Islamophobia that he didn't even realize. Or maybe I'm being too charitable and Miller actually is a Muslim-hating bigot. I don't know Frank Miller's intentions, but what I do know is that the narrative tools he utilizes are emblematic of a deeper issue of Islamophobia that runs rampant in the media. Like I said, check out my video for a deeper explanation of that topic. With all that in mind, what's the verdict? Is Dark Knight 3 Master Race good or bad? Well, first and foremost, the art by Andy Kubert, John Romita Jr., and Frank Miller looks spectacular. The art pops and does a great job at bringing Miller's Elseworld universe to life. And barring the Islamophobic undertones, Miller's story is surprisingly nuanced. His characters are written with unique voices, clearly defined motivations, and relatable personalities. And while the plot is a little par for the course when looking at superhero comics, it's still really fun. I would say overall this book is a hidden gem that is often overlooked by fans due to the negative standing of The Dark Knight Strikes Again. But somehow, that's not the end of Miller's Dark Knight universe, because there's one more book that follows Dark Knight 3, and that is Dark Knight Returns, The Golden Child. Dark Knight Returns Golden Child came out in 2019. It's once again written by Frank Miller with fabulous artwork by Rafael Grampá. If Dark Knight Returns is the golden boy, Dark Knight Strikes Again is the ugly duckling, and Master Race is the flawed but underrated middle child, Golden Child is the youngest one that everyone forgets about. This book is so forgettable that there isn't even a Wikipedia page for it. So I'll give you guys a plot overview. The book takes place several years after The Dark Knight 3 Master Race. Carrie Kelly has continued the legacy of the Dark Knight, carrying the mantle of Batwoman. Meanwhile, Laura, the daughter of Superman and Wonder Woman, finds herself struggling to find faith in humanity, mostly because of her elevated status in society as a Kryptonian. However, this time, Laura isn't totally alone in her mission. She's joined by her younger brother, Jonathan Kent, the son of Superman and Wonder Woman, and a toddler with a seemingly massive head. The first few pages start out really strong. The opening to this narrative seemingly promises a complex character study, one that focuses on lineage and personal responsibility. But unfortunately, the story quickly spirals into a disorderly mess once Joker and Darkseid pop up. Now here's the thing, Joker was killed in Dark Knight Returns. He comes back in Dark Knight Strikes Again, but this time Joker is Dick Grayson pretending to be the Joker, and Batman promptly kills Dick. So who is the Joker in this book? I have no idea. It's not really explained. But yeah, Joker and Darkseid are working together to create disorder and scare law-abiding citizens, so Darkseid's agents of chaos are the only one who go to the polls to vote for the president. And yeah, the imagery of Trump is invoked a lot in this book. This book came out during an election year, and Miller makes it clear that he's not a fan of Donald Trump. And look, I'm not either. Donald Trump is a horrible person who utilizes his platform to spread misinformation, target marginalized groups, and openly question the validity of the constitutional process. There is a very real argument to be made that Donald Trump is slowly plunging the country into fascism. So, on the surface, you would think I would enjoy Miller's political messaging, but it just doesn't work. When you skip to the last page of this book, you'll see an image of Carrie Kelly's Batwoman leading an army of rioters. They stand tall and proud, free from the shackles of Darkseid's mind control, ready to battle fascism with pure hearts and bloodied hands. In the cohort of rioters, we even see a young girl who resembles the political activist Greta Thunberg, but then that's it. We don't see them restore order, fight fascism, and lay down the groundwork for a better society. There's simply an idealistic implication that fighting against tyranny with good intentions is all you need to do. It's an oddly optimistic ending from a creator who's known for his dark and anarchistic deconstruction of superheroes. And using Trump as a one-to-one political analog instantly makes this book feel dated, while also downplaying the real-world political harms Trump is responsible for. The reason Trump won isn't because a cosmic alien used him as a puppet. The reason Trump won is because politics in the United States transform radically every year. Super PACs and private interest groups have gained immense control over legislative procedure, with millions of dollars of influence being transferred via campaign donations. While politicians continue to fatten their pockets, the constituents who voted for these politicians often get left in the dust. Sure, some politicians try to pass policy to help their voters, but this policy usually stalls and fails due to bureaucratic inefficiency. Meanwhile, other politicians immediately abandon their campaign promises once in office. Simply put, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And it's only gotten worse. Trump came along during a perfect time where materialistic conditions were not good for a lot of people. Trump voters felt abandoned, and then comes along a guy who says he's going to drain the swamp and rebuild from the ground up. It's a radical promise, but he seemed like he meant it. On top of that, he said what he wanted to, no regard for the implications of his words. It's a laissez-faire style of communication that resonated with people because it felt raw and honest, while still being a little bit problematic and edgy. Trump doesn't exist because he's a uniquely evil person that wanted to take over the world. Trump is a product of the increasingly polarized political environment we have created. When modern institutions fail, radical reactions become normalized. Miller had an opportunity to explore this type of political nuance, but instead he went for the libbed up route, saying nothing more than Trump is evil and we gotta resist that. It's kind of ironic that with The Dark Knight Returns, Miller created a world where he cautioned his readers to be wary of political institutions, advocating for anarchistic resistance in the face of repression. While with this book, the ham-fisted politics reads to me like Miller is basically saying, vote blue no matter who. And with this seemingly being the final installment in Miller's Dark Knight universe, it's safe to say that what started out as a radical interrogation of societal norms has now turned into a quasi-endorsement of democratic institutions and civic duty. The message in Golden Child isn't necessarily a bad one, but it's so far removed from The Dark Knight Returns, it feels almost contradictory to what the series initially represented. Though you could argue that about each subsequent sequel. What started with the revolutionary storytelling of Dark Knight Returns turned into the disjointed DC superhero homage that was Strikes Again. It was then followed by the surprisingly consistent character drama in Dark Knight 3, and ultimately concluded with the one-shot political call to action found in Golden Child. Miller's Dark Knight universe is a rocky and inconsistent mess, one that boasts both promise yet yields disappointment. That's not to say it lacks merit. Scattered throughout are moments of brilliant character work, striking artwork, and ambitious world building, but for every glimmer of genius there is an equal and sometimes overwhelming dose of muddled storytelling, uneven art, and politically problematic themes. And all of this is ultimately what makes it so that what started with such a loud and thunderous impact in The Dark Knight Returns faded into a quiet and uneventful end with Dark Knight Golden Child. But that's just my opinion. What do you guys think of these books? Have you read them? Let me know down below. Huge shout out to the homie David, aka Doze Comics, for giving his input on this video. He's a great friend of the channel. Make sure to check out his YouTube. He makes really great content, especially if you like comic book content. Also, shout out to every Spider-Man ever for reading some of the quotes. He also makes some really great Spider-Man content. Make sure to check out his channel as well. If you guys are looking to get comic books like Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, make sure to check out Organic Price Books. It's a website that sells collected edition comic books at up to 50% discounts, and you can use my code YUHU to get even more discounts on checkout. If you guys like this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below what you thought. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.